Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO, and this is the first Mike VanDusen lecture. Yay, applause are in order. Supported by the Center and our Middle East project, headed by the one and only Hala Esfandiari. This was Hala's idea, and you're in for a treat. First, I would like to recognize Mike VanDusen. He's the guy in the boring tie in the front. He will be thanked for years of yeoman service a bit later today. Also, Moroccan Ambassador Rashad Boulal is here. I think he is here. He's not here. All right. Lebanese Ambassador Antoine Shadid. Soon-to-be Ambassador from Lebanon, Tony Frangi. Are they here? The former chairman of our Board of Trustees, Joe Gildenhorn, and his wife, Alma Gildenhorn. They are now the co-chairs of our Wilson Cabinet. And two of our board members, Barry Jackson, longstanding board member, and our brand-new board member, where is she? Jane Stetson, in the front row. And there are many supporters and friends of the Wilson Center. As I mentioned, this was Hala's idea, and it is really something that we're very proud of. Yes. Why this is hard for me today, I don't know, but I think it's been just a slightly confusing day. In Bob Gates' highly anticipated memoir, which was released yesterday, did anyone miss it? He had some harsh words for my former employer. He wrote, quote, "I saw most of Congress as uncivil, incompetent at fulfilling their basic constitutional responsibilities, such as timely appropriations, micromanagerial, parochial, hypercritical, egotistical, thin-skinned, and prone to put self and re-election before country," unquote. Ouch. As a former member who spent 9 terms up there, I can tell you that the business model is badly broken, but many members aren't. In my experience, most members arrive determined to add value, and many have real talent, but the paradigm of blaming the other side takes a huge toll. And that's why it is so renewing to work in the safe political space the Wilson Center provides. Mike VanDusen, Lee Hamilton, and I all remember a better time, and many of you do too, an era when it was actually possible to cross the aisle to get something done. Think Tip and the Gipper, as Chris Matthews dubbed them in a recent book. Mike was a legend on the Foreign Affairs Committee. In the wake of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, he quickly put the staff to work with the Bush NSC on a plan for unprecedented support for democracy building and economic assistance, which some Republicans were wary of at the time. Mike also organized the staff of both parties to support the December 1995 vote in the House funding more than 20,000 U.S. troops who were to police the Dayton Accords. I even have it on good authority that every time he went on an overseas trip, Mike went on shopping sprees for his flashy ties and would give them as gifts to both Democrats and Republicans. Bob Hathaway, the director of our Asia program, who worked under Mike on the Hill, said it best, quote, "The staff understood that we weren't simply working for an individual or a party, but for the United States Congress." Hear, hear. It's in this tradition that the legislative branch can and should have a role in foreign policy, but in a smart way. And that's why I personally applaud Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid for saying today, as I understand it, that he will hold the Iran sanctions legislation, which has a huge number of co-sponsors, in order to give diplomacy a chance. So it's fitting that the inaugural Mike VanDusen lecture on the Middle East focuses on Congress, the good, the bad, and the ugly. David Ignatius, our featured speaker, and another Washington wise man and very dear friend of mine and the Center's, spoke in November at Indiana University on imagining a Hamiltonian, that would be Lee Hamilton, foreign policy. He said, quote, "For me, Lee Hamilton stands for a kind of liberality of spirit and an internationalism of the heartland, not of the coast, but of the very bedrock of America. He is an embrace of the world from the very center of who we are as a country." Though Mike is from the coast, from Pennsylvania, and a product of Ivy Princeton, he embodies these values too. And so does the Wilson Center. And I think it's time for Congress to move once again in that direction. So now please welcome Hala Esfandiari, who will introduce the Middle East Project's role here and obviously say whatever she wants to say about the extraordinary David Ignatius and our lovely Mike VanDusen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jane. I must confess that this is the proudest moment in my 16 years at the Middle East program, a small program that started in 1998 as a project in a little windowless room in the Smithsonian Castle, is today launching the Michael VanDusen lecture series on the Middle East, a dream I have had a decade and finally came to fruition. I thank Marina and David Ottaway, who helped make this lecture series possible. Jane embraced the idea when I proposed it, as did all my colleagues at the center. I first met Mike in 1998. We were hosting a meeting on Iran. He walked in. He probably doesn't remember it. We were in the castle. He walked in, didn't sit around the main table, but sat quietly in the back of the room. I didn't know who he was. He said, "I work on the Hill." But I vividly remember, what else? The bold and daring tie he was wearing that day. Last Friday, 754 meetings later, he again walked into the auditorium, this room, to attend a meeting we were hosting on Turkey and sat in the back row. Needless to say, wearing another of his unforgettable neckties. I wonder whether he will forgive us for making him sit today in the front row. As a Middle East expert, knowing the Middle East better than anyone I have met, Mike took a lot of interest in our program. He not only attended almost all our meetings, even if only for half an hour, but he made a point to greet the speakers and talk to them. He has been immensely supportive of the Middle East program and helped shaping it. I recall when I showed him a list of participants in one of our first panels who happened to be all men, he remarked, "Oh yes, male, pale, and stale." And I have heard this sentence many times from him over the last 15 years. Under his watch, the number of female staff at the center grew rapidly. We eventually ended up with 6 women program directors, and Mike appointed the first 3 women vice presidents. Jane's appointment as the president and director of the center must have given Mike, with his strong belief in equality, particular satisfaction. Mike's door was always open, and he created a spirit of collegiality among us, which was unique. So is his inclination to downplay the key role he played among us. Every time we introduced him as the executive vice president of the Wilson Center, he would interrupt to say, "I only push papers around here." His devotion to the staff is legendary. When I was in prison in Iran, I later learned in one day he signed on his own and on Lee Hamilton's behalf 75 letters to heads of states, foreign ministers, and dignitaries that he, Lee, and Joe, our former chairman of the board, who is present here today, thought could help expedite my release. In my book, I refer to Mike as the unsung hero of my ordeal, a sentence I borrowed from my colleague Robert Litwak, who witnessed Mike spend 8 months looking for ways to secure my release. While Mike is stepping down as the chief operating officer, he's not leaving the center and he's not leaving the Middle East program. I feel sure he will continue to attend our meetings. I even entertain the hope he will agree to chair our panels and even appear on our program as a speaker, wearing one of his provocative ties. As I said in the beginning, This series means a lot to us. And I want to extend my special thanks to David Ignatius, who accepted to be the first keynote speaker in this series. David, everybody knows you. I don't have to introduce you, so please come and take the floor from me.
Well, thank you to Hala and to Jane. I'm glad that the male, pale, and stale rule is not being rigidly enforced today. That's a relief. As Jane Harman said, this is a safe space. Journalists feel that, diplomats feel that, the entire foreign policy community, I think, feels that. But I also want to say that it's precious space because of the people who were here. I'm going to talk in my remarks about Mike VanDusen, but I want to just say a word about Hala Esfandiari, whose personal courage when she was imprisoned in Iran, and whose unflappable behavior since she returned really inspires me, and I'm sure I speak for everyone in the room. When I was going to go interview President Hassan Rouhani when he came to New York to address the General Assembly, I thought, who can I consult to get good questions to ask President Rouhani? And of course I turned to Hala and to her husband, Shaul. And Hala said, you know, you ought to ask him about something he said during the presidential campaign, which is that he thinks the power of the Revolutionary Guard in Iran is too great. Why don't you ask him if he means that, and if so, what is he going to do about it? So a few weeks later, I was sitting down across from him in New York, and I managed to find a quote from what he'd said during the campaign, and I expected he'd do what politicians usually do, which was not answer or be brusque or say something, you know, to escape the question. But he actually answered it. And he said, I do think the power of the Revolutionary Guard in politics is too strong, and I think that we need changes in Iran. And I felt like reaching out to him and saying, that question came to you from Hala Esfandiari, and don't you forget it. I also want to just note the wonderful role that Jane Harman has played since she became president and director here. Jane is in danger of giving Congress, or at least former members of Congress, a good name. You know, you would have thought that that was impossible these days, and that's one of the subjects of my remarks. But it's been wonderful to see Jane, a person with so many talents, start a new career here, throw her energy and intellect into the work of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Jane is a friend, so I see her often, and I always benefit from talking to her. And so thank you, Jane, for this safe space, but as I said, precious space. So because this is a big deal for me, I've actually written out remarks. So I hope you're going to forgive me for reading them, because I want to give them to Hala afterwards so that they can be published. It is an honor for me to be asked to give this inaugural Michael VanDusen Lecture at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which celebrates Mike's commitment to the Middle East and his constant support of the Wilson Center's Middle East program. When I think of Mike VanDusen, I think first, obviously, of the U.S. Congress, the institution where he worked for 30 years in partnership, much of that time, with the center's former president, Lee Hamilton. And I think of the way in which Mike struggled to make a difference in the passionate and, in my experience, sometimes tragic story of American and indeed congressional involvement in the Middle East. The intersection of Congress and the Middle East is not always a pretty story. As I said in the title of my lecture, this is a story of the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. But as I'll try to explain, with Mike and his colleagues, I saw only good. This lecture also honors the Woodrow Wilson Center and Woodrow Wilson, who, as I was reflecting on what to say today, I realized in some ways is the architect of this very, very difficult and unstable world that he helped create in the negotiations that ended World War I, in the world that ratified the Sykes-Picot lines in the sand, as a recent book has it. Woodrow Wilson embodied that blend of American idealism, you'd have to say naivete, and the way in which it was laid on top of the remnants of European colonialism in a way that, for all of the wonder of Woodrow Wilson's intellect and genius, we see is problematic right down to our time. And I think reflecting on that, reflecting on the good and the bad that are part of the legacy of Woodrow Wilson himself, is one of our responsibilities as students of this region. We have been until today in one of those moments that I would describe as illustrating the bad side of congressional involvement in the Middle East and foreign policy, as Congress has sought to frame legislation that would impose additional sanctions on Iran, even as the U.S. government, with its partners, seeks to negotiate an agreement that would remove existing sanctions. The centerpiece of that negotiation is the demand that Iran make real concessions. President Obama, I think, has been clear that unless Iran demonstrates that the elements that are not consistent with the civilian nuclear program, the heavy water reactor at Arak that can produce plutonium, the 19,000 centrifuges, far more than a civilian program could possibly need, the fortified facility to house some centrifuges in the side of a mountain, again, inconsistent with the civilian nuclear program. Unless those are removed, a deal will be impossible. And indeed, when the president was asked publicly what he thought the chances of getting that acceptable deal were, he said it was 50-50. In other words, this is the most delicate and difficult kind of negotiation that one could imagine. So what did Congress do on the outskirts of this very delicate process? Until Senator Reid's announcement today, I think it's fair to say that what Congress did was, in effect, to throw a monkey wrench into the middle of the process. Certainly when I was in Tehran, I heard from their foreign minister and others concern about the ability of Secretary Kerry to speak for the United States, to be the leader of the P5+1 negotiating coalition. That legislation was racing forward. The last time I checked before today's announcement, it had 59 co-sponsors in the Senate. It was nearing the veto-proof two-thirds number. The support in the House was almost certainly considerably greater. Despite efforts by President Obama and other members of the foreign policy leadership from both parties to steer Congress away from this, until very recently, that was not successful, and the numbers grew and grew. Frankly, as I said before, I feel that this is an example of the bad side of congressional involvement in foreign policy. I'll speak later about Congress's involvement in war-making powers. The odd thing about this is that it's involved in something even more delicate, you could argue, which is diplomacy, which really can't operate successfully when it's subject to open political pressure back and forth. I want to talk about how we got into this situation of very intense congressional involvement in foreign policy, in particular in the Middle East. But I want to do so with a broad focus and to try to evoke the institution where Mike VanDusen spent most of his career by talking in a very personal way. I hope it will amuse Mike and other members of this audience to know that my first real job was as a congressional lobbyist. That sounds implausible, and I'll explain how it happened, but I actually was a lobbyist. I even got an amendment passed, which I'll explain to you. When I was a young man growing up in Washington, going to college, Capitol Hill was a place where I came to work. I was an intern in the office of Senator Claiborne Pell in my senior year in high school. 1968, that was the year that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was holding one of what were really a series of hearings on the Vietnam War. Senator Pell, as everyone will remember, was a gentleman, and he thought nothing could be more appropriate than letting his intern in his nice St. Albans blue blazer and white shirt sit and watch these amazing hearings take place. And so I sat absolutely transfixed. The star of the show, obviously, was Senator Fulbright, the chairman of the committee for 15 years. The cast of characters, these are names that I think, looking out at the audience, people will appreciate. On the Republican side, Senator Jacob Javits, a real giant whose son Josh is one of my regular tennis partners. From Vermont, George Aiken. From Kentucky, John Sherman Cooper. Democrats like Stuart Symington of Missouri, Mike Mansfield of Montana, and Frank Church of Idaho. And my impression as I would sit as a boy of 18 listening to these remarkable figures and the accents from the Middle South states and from the Great Plains, these accents that had the rich intonation of the real America, was that our foreign policy establishment was rooted outside the city, that it was really an establishment that was drawn from the bedrock of America. At those hearings, I had my first introduction to a fact that I think is central to American foreign policy when it's successful, and that's the role of professional staff members like Michael VanDusen. The staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that year, and indeed for, I believe, 18 years, was a man named Carl Marcy. Carl Marcy lasted even longer than Senator Fulbright, his mentor. He was joined in the period I was there by Bill Bader, who's another remarkable figure who embodied that expertise. I think of Mike VanDusen being linked to names like Carl Marcy and Bill Bader, and what I sometimes call, remembering one of my professors in college, the great chain of being. It's a phrase that people in the medieval world used to use to describe the way in which authority was handed down. And there really has been a great chain of being in foreign policy. You think of Kissinger, Brzezinski, Scowcroft, but it's also true with congressional staff members. There are these great individuals who guided committees with their members, and Mike VanDusen embodies that. My personal love story, I want to say, because it felt like that at the time with Congress, continued when I was in college. In my junior year, I worked for Ralph Nader as what was called a Nader's Raider. And, we were kind of raiding everything in sight, and we were universal do-gooders. And so I came down from college to work on something that was called the Congress Project, the idea of which was to investigate the entire Congress. I mean, in those days, that's just how ambitious Ralph Nader was. And I was lucky that summer to find another great mentor, and a name that I hope people here will remember. It was Congressman Richard Bolling from Missouri, a man who was really a student of the House of Representatives, who dreamed, I think, of being Speaker, never had that opportunity, in some ways a deeply flawed man. But he was also blessed by having a remarkable staff person. Again, I wonder if Mike remembers this name, a woman named Gladys Ewell. And Gladys Ewell was his administrative assistant. She was one of the first women to be administrative assistant to a powerful member of Congress. And, here was this kid working for Ralph Nader who, for some reason, was fascinated by everything that she and her boss had to say. So I would sit and listen to Gladys Ewell and Congressman Bowling explain to me how the House of Representatives worked. So maybe it's not surprising that when I graduated the next summer, Ralph Nader, who was then starting up his lobbying operation, said, "David, why don't you come work for me as a lobbyist on campaign finance reform?" It's 1974. We just passed through the Watergate era, so this was like the hottest issue going. And I was asked to be a member of a coalition that had in it the AFL-CIO. I'll never forget the top AFL-CIO lobbyist, Ken Young, who reported to a really frightening man who only showed up once every 6 months, named Andrew B. Miller, who, if he came in, was basically going to break your neck. So don't mess with him. The UAW had a chief lobbyist named Jack Beidler, who was, again, just an incredible figure. The intellectual leader of this group was Fred Wertheimer. Remember now, we're going back to 1974. Fred Wertheimer, then as now, was the expert, really the only student of campaign finance reform. I found this intimidating, overwhelming, wonderful. I had received a fellowship from Harvard to go study at King's College, Cambridge, and I was supposed to go in the fall of 1973, and Nader said, you can't leave, the bill's up, you got to stay. And I finally went to Ralph in November, December, and said, I just have to take that fellowship. And Nader, unforgettably to me, said, why do you want to go to finishing school when I am offering you a chance to do the most important work in the world? And, I looking back, I think, well, that's the day I became an internationalist. That's the day that and I know if Ralph Nader was here, he would say that's the day David began his downhill, increasingly rapid descent towards being an establishment fathead. A final personal recollection of Congress, and I hope you'll forgive this. This really is the last. Is from 1980, when I was assigned by the Wall Street Journal, where I was then working to cover the U.S. Senate, and I went up my first day to cover the Senate, and I was greeted by Senator Henry M. Scoop Jackson. Senator Jackson had been a friend of my father's, and he had learned that I had this job, and so he insisted that I come by, and he kind of dropped everything he was supposed to do that morning and took me on a 90-minute tour of everything that mattered to him in the Senate. And his passion for the institution, those were the days in which Richard Pearl, later known as the Prince of Darkness, was one of his congressional aides. And so again, it's hard to think of someone who knew as much about foreign policy, cared as passionately about it as Scoop Jackson. Some people would argue that he was the intellectual godfather, really, of what came to be known as the neoconservative movement. It's possible that's true. If you were to ask Henry Kissinger, in those days, Secretary of State, what he thought of Senator Jackson, half the time he was furious at him, regarding him as a meddler, regarding his support for Israel as unwavering to the point of making the conduct of foreign policy impossible. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which we remember now as a key part of the story of the decline of the Soviet Union, the unrelenting demand that Soviet Jews be allowed greater freedom, which was central to détente. At the time, executive branch policymakers were strongly critical of those policies. I have always felt that when you look at figures like the ones that I've mentioned, people like Fulbright, like Jackson, you realize that although Congress sometimes does make trouble for the executive branch in the execution of foreign policy, and sometimes in particular in the Middle East, what Congress provides is an anchor. When you have great figures like this, from administration to administration, president to president, they provide that continuity. They provide a basis of knowledge. They have staff members like Mike VanDusen who can, in effect, instruct each administration as it arrives. So I think that's that anchoring role that's played is crucial. I saw that when it seemed, as a period very much like the current period, when it seemed as if U.S. foreign policy was really the wheels were coming off. It was in 1980, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. The Iranian Revolution was in full swing. American hostages were being held in Tehran. I mean, it was a period of the most intense anxiety when people just wondered if America had lost its staying power. And I called up Senator Jackson in my role as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and asked him what he thought. And I was expecting, I guess, that he would add more fuel to the fire and say more inflammatory things and blame President Carter for his terrible mistakes. And he said the opposite. He said, this is a time when people really should calm down. They should think about America's underlying strengths. They should avoid making rash judgments and mistakes. I wrote an article that was called The World According to Scoop that appeared on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, which reflected that kind of basic good sense. And I think that, again, speaking of Congress in this anchoring role, the fact that so many of the people that I'm describing came out of the American heartland, like Lee Hamilton coming out of Indiana and the Midwest, Senator Jackson coming out of Washington State, Fulbright from Arkansas. I mean, this was the bedrock of America becoming internationalist. Following on the successes of, Dwight Eisenhower from Abilene, Kansas. I just was reading a wonderful history of the war in which Eisenhower wrote to one of his teachers, "You probably don't remember which Eisenhower I was." That's how unself-assuming these people were. I did a little bit of reading on the collected works of Mike VanDusen and Lee Hamilton to think about this lecture, and I found an article that they wrote in Foreign Policy, in Foreign Affairs in 1973, when they were talking about the basic tension between Congress and the executive branch that is always a part of this foreign policy story. In this article, they noted that the Constitution, maddeningly, is vague when it comes to allocating foreign policy powers between the president and the congressional branch. And they quoted a professor who studied this, who said that the Constitution in this vagueness isn't, and this is the quote, is an invitation to struggle for the privilege of directing American foreign policy. That struggle is what I watch play itself out as a journalist. As Lee Hamilton wrote in in a book that was published by the Wilson Center, this is a story really of cyclical movement back and forth. Lee noted that our founding presidents, Washington and Jefferson in particular, were very strong and assertive on foreign policy. Congress was almost not a factor. In the pre-Civil War years, Congress was much more assertive. The years of Clay, Calhoun, the famous names of that period tend to be on Capitol Hill. That, with the exception of Lincoln, really continued for much of the 19th century, as Lee Hamilton described it. With the collapse of Wilson's vision, the rejection of the League of Nations by Congress, we then go into another of these periods of strong congressional assertion. I did some research that may surprise people, looking into the situation Britain faced in 1939 and 1940, when it was literally at risk for its existence as a country, as the Germans were bombing London and preparing what they thought would be their invasion of Britain. And Britain launched a a little-known covert action in the parlance of the intelligence community directed against the United States. The code name for this was British Security Cooperation. It was run out of New York by somebody who's come to be known as Wild Bill Stevenson, who worked extremely closely with the British intelligence service and indeed with elements of the U.S. government. And what they did was to target those in Congress who opposed American entry into World War II. And when I describe this as a covert action, I'm not kidding. They went to the individual congressional districts of members who were skeptical about the U.S. joining the war, and basically took them apart, contributed to their opponents, put smears in the newspapers, disrupted their campaign rallies. It was one of the most extraordinary episodes that I know of. I've written about it a good deal. I wrote my first article about it in the late 1980s in the Washington Post. If you want to read more, I direct you to a novel that will be published in June, just in time for Father's Day, by David Ignatius, called The Director. And I'm happy to say this is the first public mention of this anywhere, that in the last 24 hours, this novel was just sold to the movies. So I want to say that you can go see it in a movie theater, but that's, given Hollywood, that's a little bit premature. I want to close with some comments that were made, like those that Jane quoted, by former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates in this absolutely blistering new book. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It is painful reading. You'll ask yourself, why did he write it? Why didn't he write it before? Why didn't he resign if he felt that? There are a million questions that go through any reasonable person's mind. But I think that's because it's such a valuable document. It's rare that people are as honest as Bob Gates is in this book. So I just want to briefly quote some comments he made about Congress and foreign policy. All too often, he says, during my 4.5 years as Secretary of Defense, when I found myself sitting yet again at that witness table, at yet another congressional hearing, I was tempted to stand up, slam the briefing book shut, and quit on the spot. The exit lines were on the tip of my tongue. I may be the Secretary of Defense, but I'm also an American citizen, and there is no son of a bitch in the world who can talk to me like that. I quit. Find somebody else. It was, I'm confident, a fantasy widely shared through the executive branch. Now, I'll finish the Gates quote and then make my comment. He continues. You'd think surely that would be the end of the quote. No, he goes on. Much of my frustration came from the exceptional offense I took at the consistently adversarial, even Inquisition-like treatment of executive branch officials by too many members of Congress across the political spectrum, creating a kangaroo court environment in hearings, especially when television cameras were present. Now, everybody in this room knows that members of Congress have to run for re-election, and if you're going to run for re-election in our system, you have to do various things. You have to raise campaign money, which means that interest groups that are prepared to give you money, you take seriously, and you make your decisions about what interest groups you're going to cultivate, and you get campaign contributions, and if you're lucky, you win. And everybody knows that if you're going to be an effective politician, you have to be on television, free media, and that the scramble to get television time is part of what any politician does and should do. That said, does it have to be as ugly as it's become? That's really my question. I mean, even granting the basics, that we're going to have a system in which interest groups in particular that make campaign contributions, inflammatory television, we're going to have a system that has all of that. Does it have to be at the level that we now find ourselves? And I think back to the period that I described, and that's really why I wanted to give these personal recollections of a young man, young journalist, looking at these figures of such consequence, and Lee Hamilton really at the top of the list. And I know what the answer is. No, it doesn't have to be that bad. There are people who in their time resisted it, and by the example of their resisting it, sort of provided a baseline that kept others in check. I was going to close by telling you a terrible story about one of my favorite programs called the Egypt American Enterprise Fund, which is a tiny program. Jane knows about this program. It gives $60 million a year to Egyptian small and medium-sized businesses. Now, if you were going to try to think, how would we go about enfranchising a middle class in Egypt and breaking the hold of the military and the corrupt crony capitalists who are, sadly, still in force there, it would be by encouraging precisely these people. And yet, this program, for reasons that are mystifying, was held up and almost killed. The person who's been financing it literally out of his pocket, Jim Harmon, who was named as the director, has just been, paying for it on his own for the last year and a half. Finally, basically, had decided to give up because of this hold, which I'm not going to go into the details for a simple reason. The hold was lifted last month. The person who had decided to destroy this program for no good reason, got some sense and decided to do the right thing, and the fund is back in business, and it's about to make its first major acquisition, from which will flow, I think, many tens of millions of dollars of loans. So I want to close with that basic idea that in Washington, the bad and the sometimes ugly, although they're present, don't always win out, and that it is people like Mike VanDusen and the person he worked for, Lee Hamilton, who have given this system its basic fabric. I mean, the sinews that hold our system together start with people like them. So the idea that there is a lecture in Mike's name here at this Woodrow Wilson Center is wonderful. To be asked to give the first lecture is a particular pleasure for me. And so, Mike, thank you for everything you've done for so many years.
Thank you very much, David. We would love to have a book launch for you at the Wilson Center as soon as your novel comes up. I'm a Middle Easterner. I make sure I always benefit from something. You mentioned the book. We offer you a book launch here when the book is out. And we have time for 2 quick questions from the floor, please. Yes, please. Just very brief question, please. Thank you. David, it's okay.
Yes.
It's your
yes.
Thank you.
Tom Dine. I worked 10 years in the Senate for Frank Church and a few others. Thank you for reviewing history. But I believe and feel you left out a great deal. That is the executive branch side. And people get aroused on the Hill, Senate in particular, but the House too, when policies are errant. And I'm thinking of Vietnam, Bangladesh in '71. The behavior of Nixon and Kissinger was abhorrent. And without the congressional back and forth, as you mentioned, the Corwinian struggle, God only knows where it would go. So I believe what you're reporting on is the strength and the greatness of the Constitution, which, when you work on the Hill, you worship almost, because it is so critical in trying to find that proper, appropriate middle ground. So I appreciate what you said, but remember, there are 2 branches and there are 2 sides to the story.
Well, I respect the comment, especially coming from Tom, who has lived this story. Tom, the thing that concerns me most of all is the following. as I reviewed this story, I didn't want to bore people with too much history, but what I find is that congressional involvement tends to be of the kind of after-the-fact, looking in the rearview mirror type, rather than the kinds of reviews and oversight that could stop mistakes from happening in process. I mean, Congress is an awful lot better at assigning blame after terrible mistakes have happened than reviewing what's going on, holding people accountable in real time. And I think that's Congress has demonstrated that although it asserts war-making powers, that it asserts the right to be an equal partner in these extremely consequential, sometimes disastrous decisions. I mean, who of us looking at what happened after the invasion of Iraq doesn't wish that we'd had more aggressive and effective congressional oversight before the fact that would have surfaced better all of the doubts that existed within the bureaucracies, within the State Department, the military, the CIA. I mean, doubt about the wisdom of this course was extremely widespread, but it really couldn't surface in Congress. And instead, what we tend to get, because Congress doesn't really want to make the decisions or be held responsible, is this retroactive amplification of blame, which I think becomes an impediment in itself to the formulation of policy. So I think that would really be my point. I appreciate the question because it allows me to make clearer what I want to say about this. It's not that I don't want to see Congress involved or that I think the executive branch makes the right decisions. We've just lived through a period in which it's been demonstrated how badly wrong the executive branch can go. The issue that I would ask people to think about is what would be good and effective congressional oversight, and what would have to be different for it to work that way as opposed to the way that it does work, which I frankly do find in too many instances counterproductive.
Aaron? Aaron, just wait for the mic. Aaron Miller.
Tribute to Mike, and the personal stories are really extraordinary, and I think you're 100% right. We've created a partisan system which is dysfunctional. But at the same time, Tom has a valid point. I mean, having worked for the executive branch for a good many years, I'm not entirely sure I would want the Department of State in charge of American foreign policy. And the reality is, it is what Tom referred to as that Corwinian, Edward Corwin, notion of an open invitation to struggle. You've identified the critical point. How do you strike the right balance between an executive branch that is constitutionally charged with the conduct of American foreign policy and a Congress that must play a much more assertive role, particularly in war powers, in an age of a volunteer military, where in essence the president has tremendous discretion. We're now coming off the 2 longest wars in American history, where the standard for victory was never could we win, but when could we leave? And this is, this has been Jane's point from the beginning. It's not that Congress is Congress is dysfunctional, but it has to rise to the occasion of the very individuals that you've identified in your story. And I think that if we could do that, we would all be better served.
So I would thank you, Aaron, for the comment, and I'm wanting to be in heated agreement with these comments. If you look at the story of the Vietnam War, I would say that and that was I grew up in the shadow of that as you did. I grew up in Washington. My dad actually worked for the Defense Department, so the people that he worked with were centrally involved in this. This was a generation coming out of World War II that had just never known reversal of any kind, really, and suddenly they were confronting this terrible problem. They just couldn't figure out what to do about it. It wasn't working. I really think, as I wrote over the weekend, that it broke President Johnson and broke his Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And the value of what Senator Fulbright did in that period, as America was struggling to figure out what was going on. I mean, remember, this is before the Tet Offensive, these hearings I'm describing, where Fulbright was calling people to account, where it was still, in February of 1968, it was still pretty heretical to be challenging, in this setting, American foreign policy, to be calling up the responsible secretaries, and I thought that was I thought at the time, and I think as I look back, that was happening in real time in a way that I wish we saw more. What we see these days in the aftermath of Iraq and Afghanistan, two terribly flawed wars, I think is the system just beginning to shut down. And I'm sure people in the audience have been thinking about this. I mean, we have a foreign policy process that really is very constricted now. And people, to think our way out of this, to think of creative responses to what's happening in Iraq and Syria, need to open up and talk and think, and they need help from Congress, frankly. And instead of that help, I mean, we have a Congress that's still trying to, pin down what happened to the four guys on the roof of the consulate in Benghazi. That's about seems some days that seems the beginning and the end of Congress's interest in major foreign policy issues. So somewhere there needs to be something closer to a balance. And when I think back on Fulbright and those hearings, that's closer to the kind of oversight that I think works than we've had recently.
David, we have 145 people in our overflow, so I need to read a question from the overflow that came, and that will be our last question. It says, very often it seems that congressional pressure is required to encourage the executive branch to act upon human rights concerns globally, especially in the Middle East. Why?
Well, I think this is an area where, again, I take the example of Senator Jackson and the plight of Soviet Jews and his insistence that this would be a centerpiece of American foreign policy, even though Henry Kissinger and other members of the executive branch found it just a terrible obstacle to the conduct of foreign policy. And members of Congress said no. This human rights issue is going to be central to policy. I would say that the United States, in a world where people generally pay short shrift to human rights issues, our country in general properly emphasizes them. Secretary of State Clinton, you can falter for not having been aggressive enough in her meetings with China or this or that, but I would say generally the U.S. still does put human rights issues on the agenda in ways that infuriate a lot of countries around the world. I think that the reason that human rights matters to the executive branch, to the extent it does, maybe it should be more, but to the extent that it does, is because it's politically important. Because members of Congress, pressured by interest groups often that say, you need to stand up for my constituents and their, make it a political issue, and they put the pressure on and they hold people accountable. That's an example where the fact that our system is political makes it more responsive, more focused in general on human rights issues than most systems where, frankly, politics has less of a role in the making of foreign policy. That's an example where the fact that our system is politicized produces a good result. I could give you lots of examples where the politicization produces a bad result, but that's a good one.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking